Welcome to Philosophy of Action. Last time I talked about why birth rates in Western countries are so low. There are many reasons for that, but today I want to focus on a follow-up question that often gets ignored. Let's assume for a moment that we do succeed in raising birth rates. The next obvious question becomes, where do we put all those children? In other words, the housing crisis. Across most Western countries, we're told there's a massive shortage of housing, and there are several well-known drivers for this problem that I broadly agree with. Low interest rates, which make higher prices more affordable on paper. Housing is increasingly treated as an investment rather than a place to live, especially in big cities. And most importantly, zoning laws. Planning restrictions and broader regulation frameworks which severely limit what can be built and where and by whom. On top of that, homeowners have a built-in incentive to oppose reforms that would meaningfully lower housing prices. People may say that they want their children to afford homes, but when the solution implies their own house losing half its value, the answer is usually no. That's understandable, but it matters. Try asking this to some homeowning friends or family members and see if they genuinely answer with yes. What I want to focus on today, though, are two major factors that are rarely discussed, yet are important contributing factors to the housing crisis. These are not necessarily the cause, but they matter if you want to have a full understanding of the problem. The first is cultural assumptions, and the second is labor market composition. To begin with the cultural assumptions. In modern Western culture, we assume that every couple and often every individual needs their own separate home. If you look at a typical household from the 50s onward, from let's say the boomer generation, you often see something like this. Two parents living in a full family-sized house, and their children, once they reach adulthood, needing their own family-sized houses per person. A family of four functionally ends up occupying 3 houses. Of course, with an additional 5 to 6 if you combine 2 families together. Scale that up across society and the housing demand explodes. Now compare this with many immigrant or religious households, for example Muslim families, where grandparents, parents and children often live together. 6 people may live in one house, sometimes even smaller than the Western nuclear family home. Older Western societies did this as well. Multi-generational living used to be normal, and it required far less housing per person. This doesn't mean that living apart is a bad thing, or that we should all pile on top of each other again. But it does mean that our cultural expectations have dramatically changed over the last 50 to 100 years, especially the last 50 years. And this has dramatically inflated the housing demand. Functionally speaking, an average dwelling can house approximately 4 people. This is more an example of how this could work. Yet in countries like, say, the Netherlands, we have roughly 8 million dwellings for under 20 million people, meaning that materially far more people could be housed than actually are. Approximately 32 million. Again, the 4-person per house is based on the idea that normal family homes can house on average 6 people, whilst apartments can average like around 2 to 3. The shortage therefore isn't purely physical, although it partially is, but it's also cultural and legal. As individualist materialism increases, people want more living space per person. That desire alone pushes housing demand and prices upward. The labor market composition is the second factor. Boomers often argue that younger generations have it easier because the luxury goods like TVs, cars, appliances are far cheaper than they used to be. What's usually ignored is that housing used to be cheaper than luxury goods are now. So why did this flip happen? Here's my theory. And what I want to be clear about this is that it's theoretical, because I've looked and detailed labor market statistics before the 1980s is very limited and makes statistical analysis nearly impossible. Labor follows supply and demand. If labor becomes abundant, it gets cheaper, and if it becomes scarcer, it gets more expensive. Since the 1950s, large part of Western industry, manufacturing, farming, and basic goods have either been automated or outsourced. At the same time, cultural shifts pushed more people into higher education and service sector work, and also bureaucratic work. Fewer people want to work in construction. Construction, unlike manufacturing, doesn't globalize well. You can't import houses from overseas. Well, not yet. And on top of that, regulation makes construction increasingly complex, specialized and expensive. So what happens? The labor pool shrinks, regulatory barriers rise, remaining workers gain market power, and wages in construction rise relatively to the rest of the economy. Meanwhile, labor floods into service and luxury production, both domestically and globally, making those goods cheaper and more abundant. Add to that the fact that as more luxury goods come into existence, workers' reservation wages will rise, because construction workers don't just have more bargaining power, they also need higher wages to afford participation in a more consumption-heavy economy. Therefore, they want to be paid more. All of this compounds into a higher construction cost and therefore higher housing prices. So what can be done? In theory, reduce regulatory barriers, make entry into construction easier, shift labor back to essential production such as construction, and change cultural attitudes towards construction work, and talking earlier about housing, towards how many people should or could live in one house. That's an obvious oversimplification, but it points to a real structural problem. I don't claim that these are the only causes for the housing crisis, but I do think that cultural assumptions and labor allocation are underappreciated parts of the puzzle. So I'm curious, what do you think? Do these factors matter? And if so, would you try to change them? And if so, why? And how?